A man stands at the pinnacle of his world, a titan of finance with a city at his feet. Beside him isn't his elegant, devoted wife, but his flashy, ambitious mistress. He believes he has everything: power, wealth, and 2 women vying for his attention. But he's made a fatal miscalculation. He has pushed his wife into the shadows, believing she would stay there, broken and silent. Tonight, at the most exclusive charity ball of the year, he will learn that when you try to erase a woman, you don't destroy her. You simply give her the freedom to become someone you can no longer control. And her return will not be a whisper. It will be an earthquake. The argument, like most of their arguments, lately began over something trivial and ended with a quiet, soul-crushing declaration of war. It happened at Daniel, the 2 Michelin star restaurant, where the clinking of silverware was a form of applause for the patron's own success. Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Capital, and a man whose portrait practically screamed "Master of the Universe," didn't like the way his wife Isabella had hesitated when ordering. "Just get the tasting menu, for God's sake," he'd snapped, not looking up from the glowing screen of his phone. "Don't hold up the sommelier." Isabella's fingers tightened around the linen napkin in her lap. "I was just considering the Dover sole, Richard." "You're not considering. You're dithering," he said, swiping a thumb across the screen. "It makes you look indecisive. Weak." That was his favorite word for her these days, weak. It was a label he applied whenever she expressed an opinion, a desire or a thought that didn't perfectly align with his own. For 15 years, Isabella had been the perfect corporate wife. She was beautiful in a timeless, understated way that spoke of old money and good breeding. She ran their Upper East Side penthouse with flawless efficiency, chaired the appropriate junior committees, and never ever embarrassed him. She was, in his eyes, another one of his pristine assets, like the Patek Philippe on his wrist or the Jean-Michel Basquiat painting in their foyer. And like those assets, she was expected to be silent and appreciate in value. But lately, the gilding on her cage had begun to feel less like a luxury and more like a restraint. The real reason for his temper, however, was sitting 2 tables away, holding court with a rapt audience. Scarlett Roche, a woman as subtle as a neon sign in a library. She was a real estate developer with a portfolio of shiny, soulless glass towers and a reputation for closing deals with the same ruthless aggression she applied to her social climbing. Her dress was a shade of crimson that bordered on violent. Her laughter was loud and throaty, and her eyes were fixed on Richard, with an ownership that was both a promise and a threat. She was Richard's mistress, a fact that was perhaps the worst-kept secret in their social circle. Richard finally looked up from his phone, his gaze flicking past Isabella to meet Scarlett's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A secret shared in public. The humiliation washed over Isabella in a cold wave. Later, in the silent, temperature-controlled interior of their Rolls-Royce Phantom, the silence stretched thin and brittle. "The Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala is next Friday," Isabella said softly, her voice carefully neutral. "I was speaking with the coordinator. They're still hoping you'll make a keynote address." "I'll be there," Richard said, staring out at the blurred lights of Park Avenue. "Good. My fitting for the gown is tomorrow. I was thinking of a deep sapphire Oscar de la Renta." He finally turned to look at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated boredom. "You won't be needing a gown, Isabella." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "What do you mean, it's our table? We're patrons. I've been on the planning committee for 6 months." "Plans change," he said with a shrug. "I'll be attending with Scarlett. It's a business decision. Her new development is a major sponsor, and we need to present a united front for the press." Isabella felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't just the affair anymore. That had been a deep, constant ache for the past year. This was different. This was a public execution. He was going to formally replace her at the most photographed, most talked about event of the season with her. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts. "Richard, the humiliation." "What will people say? They'll say whatever I want them to say," he retorted, his voice hardening into the one he used to crush junior analysts. "They'll say I'm with a vibrant, powerful woman who is my equal. This is how the world works, Isabella. You should have learned that by now." He paused, letting the cruelty land. "Don't come to the ball. It would be embarrassing for everyone. Stay home. Go visit your mother in the Hamptons. Do whatever it is you do. Just don't be there." The car pulled up to their building, the doorman rushing to open the door. Isabella didn't move. She stared at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and saw a stranger. The man who looked back at her saw nothing at all. He saw a piece of furniture. He was tired of an old stock he was ready to divest. "Understood?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. She didn't answer. She simply got out of the car, walked through the marble lobby without looking at the concerned doorman, and rode the silent elevator up to the penthouse that had become her prison. That night, she didn't cry. Crying was a luxury afforded to women who still had hope. Isabella Sterling was fresh out of hope. But as she stood looking out over the glittering expanse of Central Park, a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, an emotion she hadn't felt in a very long time: rage. Cold, clear, and clarifying. He had called her weak. He thought she was a decoration. He was about to find out how wrong he was. For 2 days, Isabella moved through her life like a ghost. She cancelled the dress fitting. She sent a polite, vague email to the gala committee, citing a personal family matter that required her to step back from her duties. She spoke to her staff in quiet, measured tones, her face a perfect mask of serene indifference. To the outside world, she was the dutiful wife, gracefully stepping aside. But inside her mind, a storm was raging. Richard, for his part, barely noticed her. He was energized, caught up in the thrill of his new public life with Scarlett. He left early, came home late, the scent of Scarlett's sharp, expensive perfume. Frederick Malle's portrait of a lady clinging to his suits. He treated Isabella with a detached courtesy that was more insulting than outright anger. He was a king who had already deposed his queen. Her continued presence in the castle was merely a logistical inconvenience he would soon resolve. On the 3rd day, Isabella made a phone call. Not to her mother or her society friends who would only offer platitudes and veiled gossip. She called Benjamin Carter. Benjamin was the senior partner at Carter, Llewellyn and Finch, a law firm so old and prestigious it made others look like pop-up shops. More importantly, he had been her father's lawyer and a close family friend. He had known Isabella since she was a little girl, with scraped knees and a fierce love for art history. He had also, with a heavy heart, negotiated her prenuptial agreement with Richard 15 years ago. They met not in his intimidating corner office overlooking the Statue of Liberty, but in a quiet, dusty room in the New York Public Library's Stephen A. Schwarzman building, surrounded by centuries of knowledge. It was Isabella's choice. She needed the weight of history around her, a reminder that empires rise and fall. Benjamin Carter was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen every form of human greed and betrayal. He listened without interruption, as Isabella laid out the entire story, from the subtle dismissals and financial control to the final brutal command not to attend the gala. Her voice never broke. It was low, steady, and chillingly precise. When she finished, he took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. "The prenup is ironclad, Isabella. You know that. Richard's lawyers made sure of it. In the event of a divorce, you get the Hamptons house, a settlement of $10 million, and 5 years of alimony. In his world, that's severance pay." "I'm not interested in the severance pay, Ben," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not interested in the Hamptons house, and I'm not planning to divorce him. Not yet." Ben leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Then what are you planning?" "Revenge is a messy, expensive business. It rarely leaves the victor unscathed." "This isn't about revenge," Isabella corrected him, a hint of steel in her voice. "This is about a hostile takeover. He thinks of me as a subsidiary company he owns. He's stripping my assets and preparing for a merger with a new partner. I am simply going to enact a leveraged buyout of my own life." For the first time that morning, Ben smiled. It was a faint, watery thing, but it was there. "That's the Dubois fire," he murmured, referring to her maiden name. "Your grandfather was a brilliant, ruthless man. I see him in you right now." "My grandfather also left me something Richard has always dismissed as pocket money." Isabella continued, pulling a slim file from her Hermès handbag. "He left me the Dubois Trust. Richard's accountants manage it, of course. He sees it as my little art fund. He's never bothered to look at the fine print." Ben took the file. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. They widened slightly. "Good heavens, Isabella, this isn't pocket money. The initial endowment was significant, but with compound growth over 25 years, and the specific investment clauses your grandfather stipulated, it's worth just shy of $95 million, Isabella finished for him. "And according to Clause 7, subsection B, upon my 40th birthday, which was 6 months ago, sole unrestricted control reverted to me. The managing accountants at Sterling Capital were legally obligated to inform me. They sent a letter. Richard saw it, laughed, and told me to have fun buying pretty paintings before tossing it on my desk. He never read it. He just assumed it was trivial. He assumed I was trivial. The plan began to form right there in the hallowed silence of the library. It was audacious, terrifying, and brilliant. For the next week, Isabella and Ben worked in secret. They used a discreet satellite office Ben kept for his most sensitive clients. They brought in a forensic accounting team that owed Ben a significant favor. The first step was to quietly, legally, and irrevocably move the entire Dubois Trust out from under the management of Sterling Capital's accountants. They transferred it to a private, fiercely independent bank in Switzerland. The transfer was structured in a way that it wouldn't raise any immediate red flags. It would look like a standard portfolio diversification. The second step was more complex. Isabella had spent 15 years observing Richard. She hadn't just been planning dinner parties. She'd been listening. She heard the names of companies he was targeting, the rivals he despised, the deals he considered his legacy. One name came up more than any other: Northgate Holdings, a struggling but innovative green energy firm. Richard saw it as his ticket to diversifying his portfolio and rebranding himself from a ruthless corporate raider to a forward-thinking visionary. He was in the final stages of a hostile takeover bid, slowly buying up shares to force the board's hand. He was confident, arrogant, and had told Scarlett over dinner. Isabella had overheard the call that the deal would be closed the week after the gala. It was to be his crowning achievement. "He's vulnerable there," Isabella told Ben, pointing to the Northgate file. His bid is aggressive, but he's stretched his capital thin to make it happen. He's counting on the good press from the gala to woo the last few wavering institutional investors. "What are you suggesting?" Ben asked, though he already saw the terrifying glint in her eye. "He wants to buy Northgate," Isabella said, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. "Then I'll buy it first." It was a staggering gamble. It would take almost every penny of her trust. But it wasn't just about the company. It was about the symbolism. He had tried to cast her out of his world, to bar her from the single most important night in his social and professional calendar. She wasn't just going to show up to his party. She was going to buy the dance hall, fire the band, and rewrite the guest list. The week leading up to the gala was a masterclass in deception. On the surface, Isabella was the picture of a woman in quiet retreat. She took calls from concerned friends, her voice tinged with a believable sadness. "Richard and I are just going through a difficult patch," she would murmur. "I just need some time. I'll be in the Hamptons." She did go to the Hamptons, for precisely one day. She had herself photographed by a friendly local paparazzo, a man she'd discreetly paid for years to capture flattering pictures of her at polo matches, walking mournfully on the beach, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. The photos, syndicated to Page 6 and other society blogs, painted the perfect picture: Isabella Sterling, the jilted wife heartbroken and hiding from the world. Richard saw the photos and felt a brief, satisfying pang of victory. It was all going according to plan. His wife was where she belonged, out of sight and out of mind. But while the world thought she was staring at the Atlantic Ocean, Isabella was in a sterile, anonymous office suite in Midtown, rented under a shell corporation created by Ben's firm. This was her war room. The walls were covered in whiteboards, filled with stock charts, corporate structures, and lists of Northgate Holdings' major shareholders. With the Dubois Trust now liquid and sitting in a Swiss bank, Isabella, guided by Ben and a ruthless, hand-picked M&A specialist named Maria Flores, began her assault. They operated with the precision of a special forces unit. They couldn't start a public bidding war. Richard would notice immediately. Instead, they had to move like a ghost in the machine. Maria, a woman who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed to survive entirely on black coffee and market volatility, identified the key shareholders they needed to sway. They weren't the big banks or investment firms already in Richard's pocket. They were the silent partners, the quiet hedge funds, the retired founders who still held significant sentimental stakes. Isabella made the calls herself. She didn't introduce herself as Isabella Sterling. She used her maiden name, Isabella Dubois. The name still carried weight in certain old money circles. It spoke of stability, integrity, and a time before hostile takeovers were considered a sport. Her first call was to a man named Gerald Abernathy, the 80-year-old founder of Northgate, who had been reluctantly pushed into retirement, but still controlled 8% of the company's stock. Richard had tried to court him, and when that failed, had tried to bully him, an effort that had only hardened the old man's resolve. "Mr. Abernathy," Isabella said, her voice calm and respectful. "My name is Isabella Dubois. My grandfather was Arthur Dubois." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I knew your grandfather," Abernathy said, his voice raspy. "A man of his word. They don't make them like that anymore. What can I do for you, Ms. Dubois?" Isabella didn't talk about profit margins or share prices. She talked about his legacy. She spoke of her own passion for renewable energy, a passion Richard had always mocked. She talked about preserving the company's innovative spirit, not gutting it for parts which she knew was Richard's true plan. She wasn't just offering to buy his shares. She was offering to become the guardian of his life's work. She offered him a price slightly above Richard's, but more importantly, she offered him a seat on the new board and a promise his vision would be honored. He agreed to sell her his entire stake. One by one, she and her team repeated this process. They approached a women-led venture capital fund in California that was hesitant to sell to a notorious predator like Richard Sterling. Isabella spoke to the partners not as a financier, but as a woman taking control of her own capital and destiny. They sold to her. They approached a university endowment fund, appealing to their charter for ethical investments. They sold too. Each transaction was conducted through a series of complex, layered shell companies, making the ultimate buyer impossible to trace in real time. To the market, it looked like a handful of disparate, minor investors were acquiring shares. Richard's team registered the activity, but dismissed it as market noise, small fish nibbling around the edges, while he, the great white shark, prepared for the final kill. His arrogance was Isabella's greatest shield. He simply couldn't conceive of a threat he didn't see coming. While the financial battle raged in secret, Isabella prepared for the public reveal. She didn't buy a new dress. She went into her vast temperature-controlled closet and pulled out a gown she had bought years ago but had never dared to wear. Richard had called it ostentatious. It was a custom-made Schiaparelli creation, a column of midnight black velvet that was deceptively simple from the front. The back, however, was a cascade of hand-embroidered silver and diamond shards that resembled a shattered mirror. It was a dress for a woman who was done being whole and perfect. She scheduled an appointment with the legendary hairstylist Garin, not for an elegant updo, but for a sharp, jaw-length bob that severed years of her old identity. She booked a makeup artist known for his work with powerhouse CEOs, instructing him to give her a look that was armored, not adorned. On the Friday of the gala, 5 hours before the doors of the Plaza Hotel would open, Maria Flores called. "It's done," she said, her voice betraying a rare hint of excitement. "The final block of shares just cleared. Combining our purchases with the shares already held by friendlies on the board, we have 51%. You are the majority shareholder of Northgate Holdings, Ms. Dubois. The company is yours." Isabella closed her eyes, a single deep breath steadying her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the timid, hesitant person from the restaurant a week ago. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. She was not Isabella Sterling, the wife. She was Isabella Dubois, the architect of her own future. And she was about to make her grand entrance. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers weighing thousands of pounds, each dripped light onto a sea of curated perfection. The air was thick with the scent of money, a heady mix of vintage champagne, hothouse flowers, and a dozen different perfumes, all vying for dominance. This was Richard Sterling's natural habitat. He stood near the grand staircase, a glass of Louis Roederer Cristal in his hand, feeling the familiar intoxicating buzz of being the center of gravity. Every eye was on him, and by extension on the woman clinging to his arm. Scarlett Roche was magnificent in her element. She wore a gold sequined Balmain gown that looked as though it had been poured onto her body, catching and fracturing the light with every movement. She laughed loudly, touched arms familiarly, and radiated a ferocious energy that demanded attention. Together they were a power couple for the modern age, ruthless, unapologetic, and dazzlingly successful. "Darling Marcus Thorne is here," Scarlett purred in his ear, gesturing with her chin towards a stern-looking man with a formidable silver mane. He controls the Vanguard Fund. If he's on board with the Northgate acquisition, everyone else falls in line. "I've got at him," Richard said, his smile a predatory slash. "He's old school. He just needs to see strength and a clear path to profit. And tonight—" He squeezed Scarlett's hand. "We are the picture of strength." He'd felt a small, nagging unease that morning. His chief analyst had reported some unusual trading activity around Northgate stock, a series of mid-level block purchases from untraceable offshore entities. He'd dismissed it. "It's just arbitrageurs trying to skim a profit before the sale is announced," he'd said. "Flies on the carcass. Ignore them." The idea that it could be a coordinated attack, a rival play, was laughable. No one had the capital, the nerve, or the intelligence to challenge him on his own turf. Least of all, he was certain, without even having to think about it, his wife. He thought of Isabella for a fleeting moment, picturing her on the beach in the Hamptons, a sad, lonely figure. The image gave him a sense of rightness, of order restored. She was a relic of his past, a woman suited for quiet country clubs and charity lunches. She didn't belong here in the arena where titans clashed. He was with Scarlett now, a woman who understood power, who craved it as much as he did. He and Scarlett moved through the room like sharks parting a school of fish. People clamored for a word, a nod, a moment of his attention. He was at the absolute zenith of his power, and the Northgate deal was the final jewel for his crown. He would announce it next week, and his legacy would be cemented. He finally cornered Marcus Thorne by the silent auction display, a collection of ludicrously expensive watches and vacation packages. "Marcus," Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you. You know Scarlett Roach, of course." Thorne gave Scarlett a cool, appraising look before turning his full attention to Richard. "Sterling, heard you're making a big move on the green energy sector." "The future, Marcus, the future," Richard said expansively. "Northgate is a diamond in the rough, a little polish, a little restructuring, and it's going to make our early investors very, very wealthy." "The board's been resistant." Thorne noted his voice a low rumble. "Abernathy still has a lot of loyalists." "Sentimental old fools," Richard scoffed. "They'll come around. I have the momentum. By the end of next week, it will be a done deal. I can guarantee it." As he spoke, he felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It was a change in pressure, a sudden dip in the ambient noise. Conversations near the grand entrance faltered. Heads began to turn. A wave of whispers started to ripple through the crowd, moving from the entrance inward. "What's going on?" Scarlett asked, annoyed at the distraction. Richard followed the gazes of the people around them. They were all looking at the top of the grand staircase. The master of ceremonies, a well-known television anchor, had moved to the podium, but he wasn't speaking yet. He was waiting. The orchestra had quieted. A woman had appeared at the top of the stairs. For a moment, Richard didn't recognize her. The figure was silhouetted against the gilded archway, poised and utterly still. She wore a column of black that seemed to absorb the light around her. Then she took a step forward, and the chandeliers caught the cascade of shattered silver down her back. Her hair was different, a sharp, dark bob that framed a face of pale, determined beauty. It was Isabella. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was a soft, sibilant sound, the sound of 1,000 people witnessing the impossible. This was not the heartbroken wife hiding in the Hamptons. This was not the quiet, demure Isabella Sterling they all knew. This woman was a stranger. She carried herself with an icy composure that was more intimidating than any overt display of anger. Her eyes swept the room, not with the look of a wounded animal, but with the cool, detached gaze of a monarch surveying her domain. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. It was as if he'd seen a ghost, a vengeful, exquisitely dressed ghost. Scarlett's grip on his arm tightened her perfectly manicured nails, digging into his sleeve. "What is she doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You told her not to come." Richard couldn't answer. His mind was reeling. This was a rebellion, a public act of defiance. He felt a surge of white-hot fury. How dare she? How dare she disobey him and show her face here to embarrass him, to create a scene? But as she descended the staircase, one deliberate step at a time, he realized this wasn't about creating a scene. Her eyes weren't searching for him. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She seemed utterly terrifyingly indifferent to his existence. She was moving with purpose, and her destination was not him, but the center of the room where the gala's chairwoman, Patricia Lawford, was now standing waiting for her. The two women met, and Patricia, a woman who bowed to no one, took Isabella's hands in hers and smiled a smile of genuine, profound gratitude. The room was utterly silent. Richard Scarlett, Marcus Thorne. Everyone was frozen watching this surreal drama unfold. The king was on his throne, but a new unknown power had just entered the court, and no one, least of all Richard Sterling, knew the rules of her game. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the suddenly tomb-quiet ballroom. All eyes were fixed on the bottom of the staircase, where Isabella stood beside Patricia Lawford. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC began, his voice resonating with practiced importance, "if I may have your attention for a special announcement." Richard stood paralyzed, a statue carved from rage and confusion. This had to be a nightmare. Isabella should be at home weeping. Instead, she was here, the focal point of the entire event. He could feel Marcus Thorne's questioning gaze on him, feel the weight of 100 other pairs of eyes. "As many of you know," the MC continued, "our foundation was facing a significant funding shortfall this year for our new pediatric wing. A month ago, we were on the verge of cancelling the project entirely. But then a miracle happened." Patricia Lawford stepped forward to the microphone, her face beaming. "It was more than a miracle," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It was an act of profound and decisive generosity. An anonymous benefactor came forward, not just with a donation to cover the shortfall, but with an endowment large enough to fund the entire wing and its operations for the next decade." A wave of murmurs swept the room. 10 years. The amount had to be astronomical. Who had that kind of liquid capital and that level of philanthropic commitment? People scanned the crowd looking for the usual suspects, the tech billionaires, the oil tycoons. Richard's mind was racing. An anonymous benefactor. Was this part of her stunt? A desperate bid for attention. She was using her trust fund money, her pocket money, to buy her way back into the spotlight. The thought was pathetic. He would deal with her later, privately and ruthlessly. This donor wished to remain anonymous, Patricia said, her smile widening. But tonight, she has graciously allowed us to thank her in person. It is my profound honor to introduce the new patron of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation and the savior of the St. Jude Pediatric Wing. Richard braced himself. He expected to hear his own name. Mrs. Isabella Sterling. A grand gesture to win him back, perhaps. A public appeal to his better nature. The foolishness of it all made him sneer internally. But Patricia Lawford didn't say that name. She took a breath, her eyes shining as she looked at Isabella. "Please join me in thanking Ms. Isabella Dubois." The name hit the room with the force of a physical blow. Dubois, her maiden name. It was a public declaration of separation, a severing of her identity from his. For a split second, there was confused silence. People's minds struggled to connect the quiet, sidelined Mrs. Sterling with this powerful, commanding figure being introduced by her birth name. And then the second, more powerful shockwave hit. The whispers started tentative at first, then growing in volume as the pieces clicked into place. The heartbroken wife in the Hamptons. The photos. It had all been a diversion. While they were gossiping about her personal life, she had been making a move of unimaginable scale. Isabella stepped to the microphone. She did not look at Richard. Her gaze was directed at the assembled crowd, calm and authoritative. "Thank you, Patricia," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the vast ballroom. It was a voice no one in that room had ever truly heard before. "My grandfather, Arthur Dubois, taught me that true wealth is not something you hoard, but something you deploy for the good of the community. For too long I have been a passive investor in my own life. Tonight, that changes." She kept her remarks brief, elegant, and devastatingly effective. She spoke of the foundation's work, of the children who would be saved. She never mentioned her personal life, her husband, or the circumstances that had led her to this moment. She didn't have to. The context was screaming from every corner of the room. By refusing to acknowledge him, she erased him. She had become the center of the universe, and he was a distant, irrelevant planet. As she finished, the room erupted in thunderous applause. It was genuine, awestruck applause for her generosity, but it was also applause for the sheer breathtaking audacity of the drama they were witnessing. Socialites who had pitied her an hour ago were now looking at her with a mixture of fear and admiration. Isabella, with a small, polite nod, stepped back, allowing Patricia to reclaim the podium. She then turned not to survey her victory, but to walk toward a small, reserved table at the front of the room. Waiting for her there was her lawyer, Benjamin Carter, and a woman with a severe black bob and a shark-like intensity, Maria Flores. Her new board. It was only then, as she moved through the crowd which parted for her, as if she were royalty, that her eyes finally met Richard's. There was no hatred in her gaze. No anger, no pain. There was nothing. It was the indifferent glance one might give a piece of furniture or a stranger on the street. And in that single, empty glance, Richard Sterling understood. This wasn't about the gala. This wasn't about Scarlett. This wasn't even about their marriage. This was a coup. He had been so busy watching the front door, he never realized his enemy was already inside the citadel, rewriting the maps and changing all the locks. The ground beneath his feet, which had felt so solid just moments ago, had turned to quicksand. The gasps had been for her entrance, but the true shock was only just beginning to dawn on him. The applause died down, but the buzzing in the room only intensified. The story was spreading like wildfire, a torrent of whispers, texts, and sideways glances. Richard stood frozen, the half-empty glass of champagne feeling like a lead weight in his hand. Scarlett was still beside him, but the warmth and victorious energy had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice low and tight. "Her maiden name, the Dubois Trust." "You told me that was nothing. It was nothing," Richard snarled, his mind struggling to catch up. He felt a primal urge to stride across the room, to grab Isabella's arm, to drag her out of the spotlight and remind her who was in charge. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by the hundreds of eyes on him, all watching, all judging. Marcus Thorne, the investor. He'd been so confident about winning over, cleared his throat. "Sterling," he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier collegiality. "You guaranteed me the Northgate deal would be closed by next week. You said you had the momentum." "I do," Richard insisted, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. A cold dread was starting to pool in his stomach. The timing of this, her sudden emergence as a major philanthropic power, it couldn't be a coincidence. "Are you certain?" Thorne pressed his eyes, narrowing. "Because a woman who can orchestrate a public spectacle of this magnitude right under her husband's nose is not a woman whose resources I would underestimate. You said your takeover was a sure thing. An attack like this on your personal front suggests a vulnerability I wasn't aware of. I'm going to have my team reassess our position." Without another word, Thorne turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of guests who were now actively avoiding Richard's gaze. He was radioactive. In the space of 10 minutes he had gone from the king of the ball to a court leper. Scarlett saw it too. She saw the other power players subtly turning their backs, the wives who had once envied her, now looking at her with thinly veiled contempt. She had hitched her wagon to a man she believed was invincible. Now cracks were showing in his armor, and she had no intention of going down with the ship. "I need some air," she said, detaching her arm from his. There was no darling, no term of endearment. It was the cold statement of an associate cutting their losses. She slipped away, melting into the crowd, moving towards a rival billionaire she had been cultivating on the side. Left alone, Richard finally moved. He pushed through the crowd, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He didn't care about the scene anymore. He needed to confront her. He reached her table just as a waiter was pouring her a glass of water. Ben Carter and Maria Flores stood up as he approached, forming a protective barrier. "Move," Richard commanded, his voice a low growl. Ben Carter looked at him calmly. "I don't think she has anything to say to you, Richard." "Isabella," he said, his voice rising, ignoring the lawyers. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You're making a fool of yourself, of me." Isabella looked up at him, her expression as serene as a frozen lake. "On the contrary, Richard," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the relative silence around their table. "I believe, for the first time in 15 years, I am doing something for myself. You told me not to come tonight. You were right. Mrs. Sterling shouldn't be here. So she isn't. Ms. Dubois, however, had a prior engagement." The sheer icy audacity of her words stunned him. He was losing control and he knew it. He leaned in closer, hissing, "This little stunt with your trust fund is pathetic. You think this changes anything? You are still my wife." Maria Flores chose that moment to speak, her voice sharp and precise. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, that is a point of contention. But what is not a point of contention is the current ownership of Northgate Holdings." Richard's blood ran cold. He stared at the unknown woman, then back at Isabella. "What are you talking about?" "As of 3:45 p.m. this afternoon." Maria continued, a predatory smile playing on her lips. A majority stake of 51% of Northgate Holdings was acquired by a privately held consortium, a consortium controlled entirely by Ms. Isabella Dubois. The world tilted on its axis. The buzzing in his ears became a deafening roar. Northgate, his deal, his legacy, the cornerstone of his future. She hadn't just embarrassed him. She hadn't just defied him. She had gutted him. She had taken a scalpel to the heart of his empire and carved out its most valuable prize. All those minor, insignificant stock trades. It had been her, moving in silence while he laughed at photos of her on the beach. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet, indecisive woman was gone. In her place was a strategist, a killer. A woman who had learned his games by watching him for 15 years and had just beaten him at them. "How?" was all he could manage to whisper. Isabella took a slow, deliberate sip of water. "You taught me, Richard," she said softly. "You always told me to be decisive, to never let sentiment interfere with a good investment. You said weakness is a choice. I simply chose to be strong." He had no response. There was nothing to say. He had been publicly humiliated, financially outmaneuvered, and personally annihilated. He turned and stumbled away from the table, the whispers and stares of the crowd following him like a physical assault. He was no longer a king. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost at a feast that was no longer in his honor. His empire hadn't just been challenged, it had been conquered. And the new queen didn't even grant him a backward glance. The fallout from the Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the financial world was already ablaze with the story. It had been christened the Dubois coup by a witty blogger at Dealbreaker, and the name stuck echoing through the trading floors and boardrooms with a mixture of awe and schadenfreude. Richard Sterling was no longer just a headline. He was a punchline. He arrived at the offices of Sterling Capital before dawn, a hollowed-out man moving through the familiar halls on sheer desperate instinct. The silence of the vast office was unnerving. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, the same view of Manhattan's skyline that had always made him feel like a god, and felt nothing but a gnawing emptiness. The city lights seemed to mock him, glittering like the shards of the shattered mirror on Isabella's gown. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange sounded not like an opportunity, but like a death knell. He watched the ticker for Sterling Capital ticker symbol STG appear on his screen. It opened down 15%. Within the hour, it was down 30%. The phones on the trading floor outside his office began to ring with a frantic, unending shrillness. His top analyst, a young, sharp-witted man named David Chen, whom Richard had personally mentored, entered the office without knocking. His face was pale. "Sir," he began, his voice strained. "It's a bloodbath. Marcus Thorne's fund liquidated their entire position at market open. It triggered a cascade. Everyone is running for the exits. The lenders for the Northgate bid are calling. They're invoking the material adverse change clause, citing reputational risk. They're pulling our credit line." Richard didn't turn from the window. "Sell the Westbrook portfolio," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "And the holdings in the Asian Tech Fund. Cover the margin calls." "Sir, that's our most profitable fund." "Just do it!" Richard roared, finally spinning around his face a mask of primal fury. David flinched, took a step back, and nodded before retreating from the room, leaving the king alone in his collapsing castle. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on the perception of invincibility. Now the world knew he had been outmaneuvered not by a rival hedge fund or a foreign power, but by the quiet, unassuming woman he had sent to the Hamptons to grieve. The humiliation was a deeper wound than the financial loss. His social death was just as swift and merciless. That week, he walked into the grill, the Midtown Power lunch spot, where his presence had once commanded the best table and felt a change so profound it was physical. The hum of conversation didn't just quiet, it shifted, turning into a low murmur of whispers that followed him as he was led, not to his usual booth, but to a small, isolated table near the kitchen. Men he had closed million-dollar deals with on a handshake now found the pattern of their bread plates intensely fascinating. No one met his eye. He ate alone, the taste of ashes in his mouth, and left without finishing his meal. His final encounter with Scarlett took place a week later. She summoned him to a cold, impersonal bar in the Mandarin Oriental. She was already there when he arrived, nursing a glass of mineral water. There was no pretense of affection. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "Richard," she began, foregoing any greeting, "I hear you're liquidating assets to shore up capital. Your commercial property on 52nd Street, the apex building. I'm prepared to make you an offer." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a number so far below market value, it was a direct insult. He stared at her, a wave of nauseating clarity washing over him. He had blown up his life for this woman, for what he thought was a partnership of equals of two hungry predators. He saw now that she had only ever seen him as a bigger shark to swim alongside, and now that he was wounded and bleeding, she was ready to join the feeding frenzy. "You have a lot of nerve." He breathed the words tasting like poison. She shrugged, unfazed. "It's just business, Richard. A lesson I learned from the best." She gave him a pointed look. "Don't be sentimental. It makes you look weak." He crumpled the paper in his fist and stood up, throwing a $100 bill on the table. He walked away without looking back, the echo of his own cruel words chasing him out into the cold city night. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella's new era was dawning in the quiet, elegant offices of Carter, Llewellyn and Finch. She sat opposite Ben Carter, signing the last of the divorce papers. Richard's lawyers had postured and threatened, but it was a hollow performance. With his finances in turmoil and his reputation in shreds, he had no appetite for a protracted public legal battle he was sure to lose. Isabella had asked for nothing from him. No alimony, no property, no settlement. She wanted only two things: a clean break and the legal right to the name she was born with. Her petition, citing irreconcilable differences in business philosophy, was granted without contest. She walked out of the law office not as Isabella Sterling, the former wife, but as Isabella Dubois, a free woman. Her leadership at Northgate Holdings was a revelation. She moved into the chairwoman's office and immediately had the heavy, dark mahogany furniture replaced with glass, steel, and light wood. She didn't rule from on high. She walked the floors talking to engineers and scientists, her questions sharp and insightful. She reinstated Gerald Abernathy to the board, not as a figurehead, but as a chief advisor, and his old-guard wisdom combined with her fresh strategic vision proved to be a potent combination. In her first board meeting, she didn't present a plan for stripping assets and maximizing short-term profit as Richard would have. Instead, she unveiled a 5-year plan for investment in next-generation solar and battery technology, arguing that legacy was more valuable than quarterly returns. The board, accustomed to Richard's brand of corporate raiding, was stunned, then captivated. They voted for her plan unanimously. She found a new home, a penthouse apartment in Tribeca, with a terrace that overlooked the Hudson. It was modern, filled with light, and decorated, not with the imposing museum-quality art Richard had collected as investments, but with the vibrant, challenging works of emerging artists she truly loved. She established the Dubois Foundation, which quickly became a major force in the city's cultural life, endowing an arts education program for public schools. She was building a world that reflected her own values, a world of growth, beauty, and quiet strength. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after the gala, her car was stopped in traffic on Park Avenue. She glanced out the window and saw him. Richard was walking out of his office building looking diminished. His shoulders were stooped, his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and the confident stride of the master of the universe had been replaced by the weary shuffle of a man burdened by defeat. He looked up, and for a long, silent moment, their eyes met across the chaotic stream of yellow taxis and black cars. She saw in his face a flicker of confusion, of anger, of something that might have been regret. In that moment, Isabella felt no surge of triumph, no lingering bitterness. The rage that had fueled her had long since cooled, leaving behind not a scar, but clean, solid ground on which to build. He was simply a man from another lifetime, a ghost from a story that had already ended. She gave him a single small final nod, a gesture not of forgiveness or pity but of closure, an acknowledgement of a past that was well and truly past. Then the traffic moved, her driver accelerated, and she turned her head facing forward, watching as the city skyline unfolded ahead of her. The car carried her downtown away from the life that had been, and towards the one she was creating a future bathed in the bright, clear light of her own making. And there you have it. The story of Isabella Dubois is a powerful reminder that the people others underestimate are often the ones with the most strength held in reserve. Her journey wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclamation. She reclaimed her name, her power, her identity, and her future. Richard Sterling didn't lose his empire because of a bad business deal. He lost it because he fundamentally failed to see the value, intelligence, and fire in the woman standing right next to him. What did you think of Isabella's incredible transformation? Have you ever witnessed someone turn the tables so completely on a person who wronged them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by Isabella's story of strength and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. And if you want more stories of dramatic twists and powerful comebacks, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner power. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story. The air at the Sterling-Rossi wedding tasted of money, old new, and oceans of it. Lilies imported from Dutch glasshouses fought a losing battle against the cloying scent of 1,000 competing perfumes. Isabella Rossi, 7 months pregnant and radiant, in a gown that cost more than a suburban house, felt a single cold drop of sweat trace its way down her spine. Her fiancé, Richard Sterling, the man who was supposed to be waiting for her at the end of the aisle, was missing. And in the pit of her stomach, where their child kicked softly, a primal instinct screamed that this was no simple case of cold feet. She was about to discover a betrayal so profound it would not only shatter her heart, but threaten to bring 2 corporate empires crashing to the ground. The union of Isabella Rossi and Richard Sterling was less a romance and more a coronation. It was the merger of 2 dynasties, a meticulously planned corporate maneuver, wrapped in the fairy tale trappings of a high society wedding. The Rossis, with Isabella at the helm of their marketing division, commanded a global luxury goods empire. Rossi lifestyle, built on Italian craftsmanship and timeless elegance. The Sterlings, a colder, sharper dynasty of American finance, were led by Richard's formidable mother, Victoria Sterling. Their firm Sterling Holdings had its tendrils in every corner of the global market. The marriage was the final seal on a multi-billion-dollar merger agreement, a pact that would create a conglomerate of unparalleled power, Sterling Rossi Global. To the outside world, Isabella and Richard were the perfect couple. She was the warm, creative heart. He was the charming, ambitious face of new money. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of paparazzi flashes, charity galas, and weekend trips to Monaco on the Sterling private jet. Richard had courted her with the kind of grand cinematic gestures that left gossip columnists breathless. He'd once filled her Milan apartment with 1,000 white orchids, her favorite simply because she'd had a stressful week. He'd written her name in the sky over the Hamptons. He was attentive, devoted, and seemed utterly captivated by her. But a gilded cage is still a cage. Isabella's brother, Leo Rossi, never trusted him. Leo, 2 years her senior, was the stoic, watchful CEO of the Rossi empire. He had the soul of an old-world craftsman and the mind of a shark. "He performs for you, Bella," he'd told her a month before the wedding, his voice low and serious, over a glass of Barolo in his study. "No one is that perfect. He's playing a role, and you need to figure out what his script is." Isabella had dismissed it as brotherly overprotectiveness. "You see everyone as a business opponent, Leo. He loves me, and I love him." Her love was genuine. She saw past the polished Sterling veneer to a man she believed was simply trying to live up to the impossible expectations of his mother. Victoria Sterling was a woman carved from ice and ambition. She viewed emotion as a liability and affection as a currency to be dispensed sparingly and strategically. She approved of Isabella not as a daughter-in-law, but as a priceless asset. The pregnancy, which they had announced 3 months prior, had only increased Isabella's value in Victoria's cold calculus. A male heir would solidify the dynasty. The wedding preparations had been a military-grade operation orchestrated by Victoria. The venue was a historic Long Island estate, its sprawling lawns rolling down to the calm, grey waters of the Sound. The guest list was a who's who of global finance, European aristocracy, and Hollywood royalty. Every detail was curated to scream power. The champagne was vintage, the orchestra was from Vienna, and the 5-tier wedding cake was a confectionery marvel flown in from Paris. The week leading up to the ceremony had been a blur of contractual meetings disguised as family dinners. Lawyers outnumbered cousins. The talk was of stock options, board seats, and brand synergy. Richard, usually so attentive, had become distant, his phone a permanent fixture in his hand. He'd wave away her concerns with a dazzling smile. "Just last-minute merger madness, my love. The price of building our empire. After Saturday, it's just you, me, and the little one. I promise." He had a best man, Marcus Thorne, who was also a senior VP at Sterling Holdings. Marcus was slick and obsequious, always laughing a little too loudly at Richard's jokes, his eyes constantly scanning the room. Isabella found him unnerving. He had a way of looking at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Resentment, perhaps, or a predatory hunger that was deeply unsettling. She'd mentioned it to Richard once, who had simply laughed it off. "Marcus, he's harmless, a bit of a suck-up, but he's been my right hand for years. Don't you worry your beautiful head about him." On the morning of the wedding, the bride's suite at the estate was a flurry of activity. Her mother, Sophia Rossi, a woman whose warmth was a direct contrast to Victoria's frost, was fussing with the lace on her veil. Her bridesmaids, a giggling trio of her oldest friends from university, were sipping champagne. But Isabella couldn't shake a deep, gnawing anxiety. She hadn't seen Richard that morning. He had stayed at a nearby hotel with Marcus, as per tradition, but he had promised to come to her suite for a private moment before the chaos began, just the two of them. He was an hour late. She'd called him twice. The first time it went straight to voicemail. The second time he'd answered his voice breathless and rushed. "Sorry, darling. Got held up. Marcus needed me for something. A little best man crisis. I'm on my way now. I love you." But there was a noise in the background, a faint feminine giggle. Before she could ask, he'd hung up. "Everything all right, Kara?" her mother asked, her gentle hands stilling on her shoulders. Isabella forced a smile. "Fine, Mama. Just nerves." But it wasn't nerves. It was a splinter of doubt lodged deep in her heart that was beginning to fester. She walked to the grand window of the suite, which overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens where hundreds of guests were already beginning to gather. She saw Victoria Sterling holding court near the grand floral arch, a triumphant queen surveying her kingdom. She saw Leo standing apart, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight as he stared toward the main house. Their child chose that moment to give a strong, decisive kick. Isabella placed a hand on her stomach, a silent promise running through her. "I will protect you, always." The words were a vow, though she did not yet know the war she was about to declare. The drop of sweat completed its journey down her back, and the fairy tale began to curdle. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, but the leading man had gone off script, and Isabella was about to become the director of an entirely different kind of show. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one taut with an unspoken tension that began to suffocate the joyous atmosphere of the bride's suite. The laughter of her bridesmaids became forced. The bubbles in their champagne seemed to die with a fizz of anxiety. Isabella's phone remained silent on the antique vanity, a sleek black mirror reflecting her perfectly made-up face, a mask of serene beauty that was beginning to crack at the edges. "He'll be here," her friend Jessica said, a little too brightly. "You know what grooms are like. Probably lost his cufflinks or something." But Isabella knew Richard. He was meticulously organized, a trait hammered into him by his mother. He didn't lose things. He didn't run late for appointments of this magnitude, not unless he was distracted. The wedding planner, a severe woman named Ms. Albright with a headset permanently attached to her ear, appeared at the door. "5 minutes, Ms. Rossi. Your father is waiting downstairs. The guests are seated." Her eyes darted around the room, noting the absence of the groom. A flicker of professional panic crossed her face before being ruthlessly suppressed. "He was supposed to be here," Isabella said, her voice quiet. "I'm sure he's on his way to the altar." Ms. Albright chirped, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Shall we?" Isabella took a deep breath, the boning of her custom-made gown feeling suddenly like a straitjacket. "I need a moment. Please. Just tell my father 2 more minutes." As soon as the door clicked shut, she looked at her brother's number and pressed call. He answered on the first ring. "Where is he, Leo?" she asked, dispensing with pleasantries. Leo's voice was grim. "I don't know. Marcus is out there by the archway, looking like the cat that swallowed the canary. He told me Richard was composing himself. Victoria is starting to look murderous, and not in her usual way." A new wave of nausea washed over her, this one having nothing to do with her pregnancy. "Leo, he called an hour ago. He said he was with Marcus. I heard a girl laugh." Silence on the other end of the line. When Leo finally spoke, all traces of forced calm were gone. His voice was cold steel. "Where are you, Bella?" "In the suite. They want me to start walking." "Don't move," he commanded. "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming up. Something is wrong." The call ended. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of the opulent room. Her friends watched her, their earlier cheerfulness replaced by a shared silent dread. The scent of lilies was now overwhelming funereal. It was the scent of decay. She had to know. "I need some air," she announced, her voice surprisingly steady. She began walking toward the door, her heavy train whispering behind her. "Bella, wait," her mother cried out. "Your dress, you can't go out there." But Isabella didn't stop. She moved with a purpose that scattered her entourage like birds. She swept past Miss Albright in the hallway, ignoring her frantic protests. She ignored the confused looks from caterers and staff. Her instincts were a roaring fire in her gut, guiding her steps, pulling her not towards the garden, not towards the ceremony, but in the opposite direction, down a secluded corridor that led to the estate's private wing. The library, the billiards room, and a series of small private studies reserved for the estate's owners. It was a part of the house the guests were not meant to see. The air here was still and cool. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of her footsteps. She passed the grand library, its doors firmly shut. She passed the billiards room. And then she saw it. At the end of the hall, the door to the smallest study, the one with the old mahogany desk and the view of the secluded woods, was slightly ajar. A sliver of light cut across the dark hallway, and from within she heard a sound that would be seared into her memory forever. It wasn't a giggle this time. It was a soft, breathy moan. Her blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her hand, clutching the bouquet of white peonies and roses, began to tremble violently. The baby inside her was still, as if sensing the impending shockwave. This was a dream, a nightmare. It had to be. In a moment, she would wake up in her bed, and Richard would be there, and this horrible, suffocating feeling would be gone. Then she heard his voice, low and husky, a voice she knew better than her own. "We don't have much time." He said his words punctuated by another soft, feminine sound. Anger, white hot and volcanic, erupted through the ice of her shock. It propelled her forward. Her trembling stopped. Her hand was steady. She didn't throw the door open. She pushed it slowly, silently. The scene that greeted her was a tableau of obscene betrayal. It wasn't a quick, stolen kiss. It was far, far worse. Richard, her Richard, was there, his perfectly tailored wedding tuxedo jacket thrown carelessly over a chair. His bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his shirt was unbuttoned, revealing his chest. He was leaning against the large mahogany desk, and in his arms, her body pressed against his, was a woman. Isabella recognized her instantly. It was Scarlett Dubois, a junior analyst from Sterling Holdings, a pretty brunette with ambitious eyes whom Richard had once dismissed as eager but harmless. Scarlett's dress, a slinky emerald green number completely inappropriate for a morning wedding, was hiked up high on her thighs. Her hands were tangled in Richard's hair. Her lipstick, a garish shade of crimson, was smeared around her mouth. And on the desk, next to a half-empty glass of what looked like whiskey, sat Richard's phone. They hadn't seen her. They were lost in their sordid little world, just meters away from where their families, their friends, their entire world awaited their union. Isabella didn't scream. She didn't cry. A strange, terrifying calm washed over her. It was the calm of the eye of a hurricane, a pocket of absolute stillness before total devastation. She took one step into the room. The heel of her shoe clicked on the hardwood floor just inside the doorway. It was the only sound needed. Richard's head snapped up. His eyes widened first in confusion, then in pure, unadulterated horror. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pasty and sick. He shoved Scarlett away from him so abruptly that she stumbled backward, nearly falling. "Bella." He choked out his voice, a strangled whisper. It's not what it looks like." It was the oldest, most pathetic cliché in the book, and it was the spark that lit the fuse. Isabella looked from his panicked face to Scarlett's, who was now staring at her with a mixture of fear and defiance. She looked at his undone shirt, at the smeared lipstick, at the jacket, lying discarded like a promise he'd just thrown away. Then her gaze fell to the phone on the desk. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked away. "Bella, wait. Please." Richard's desperate cry followed her down the hall. She heard him scrambling, fumbling to fix his clothes to chase after her. But just as he reached the hallway, another figure appeared, blocking his path. It was Leo. His face was a mask of thunderous rage. He had seen her face as she emerged from the corridor, and he had understood everything in an instant. "You are not taking one more step toward my sister." Leo snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He placed a firm hand on Richard's chest, stopping him cold. Isabella didn't look back. She kept walking her back straight, her head held high. She walked past the confused staff, past Ms. Albright, who was now babbling into her headset. She walked to the grand staircase where her father, a kind man with a gentle face, was waiting for her, his expression a mixture of pride and confusion. "Isabella, what's wrong? Where have you been?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She looked at her father, the man who had always protected her, and for the first time a single tear escaped and traced a path through her perfect makeup. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. "The wedding is off," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the air. She didn't wait for his response. She lifted the microphone from the small podium that had been set up for the officiant. Her hand was rock steady. She walked past the stunned string quartet, past the floral arch, and stood before the hundreds of seated guests. The murmuring crowd fell silent, their faces a sea of confusion. They saw a bride impossibly beautiful standing alone at the altar. They expected a tearful announcement of a delay. They expected an apology. They got a revolution. The silence that fell over the garden was absolute. It was a heavy, breathless void, filled only by the distant cry of a seagull and the rustle of leaves in the sea breeze. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on Isabella, a solitary figure in white against a backdrop of obscene floral abundance. In the front row, Victoria Sterling's face had tightened into a mask of confused displeasure. She started to rise, a silent command for Isabella to step down, but a sharp look from Leo, who had now taken a position a few feet to his sister's right, froze her in place. Isabella's knuckles were white where she gripped the microphone. She could feel the baby, a tiny, innocent life, nestled safely inside her. That thought was her anchor. It was her strength. She wasn't just a jilted bride. She was a mother, protecting her child from a legacy of lies before it could even begin. She lifted the microphone to her lips. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was clear, resonant, and carried the cold, hard weight of undeniable truth. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd, deliberately avoiding Richard's family. "I want to thank you all for coming here today to celebrate what was meant to be a joyous occasion. A nervous titter went through the crowd. This was not the expected script. "I have a brief announcement to make," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "There will be no wedding today." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Phones previously tucked away out of politeness began to emerge from pockets and purses. Victoria Sterling was now fully on her feet, her face ashen, her eyes shooting daggers at Isabella. The union between the Rossi and Sterling families, and by extension the merger between our companies, is hereby cancelled, effective immediately. This was no longer a personal drama. It was a corporate bombshell. Murmurs erupted into a low roar. Men in tailored suits began speaking urgently into their phones. The stock market wasn't open on a Saturday, but they knew the bloodbath that would ensue on Monday morning. "Bella, stop this!" Victoria's voice was a sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the noise. "You are hysterical. What is the meaning of this?" Isabella finally turned her eyes to Victoria. There was no fear in her gaze, only a chilling, profound pity. "You should ask your son, Victoria," she said, her voice dropping yet still carrying across the amplified system. "You should ask him what he was doing just a few moments ago in the estate's private study." At that moment, Richard finally appeared at the edge of the garden, skidding to a halt on the manicured grass. He had managed to straighten his clothes, but his face was a wreck of sweat and panic. Marcus Thorne was beside him, whispering frantically in his ear. Scarlett was nowhere to be seen, having evidently made a swift and cowardly exit. "Bella, don't do this," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as he started to push his way through the stunned guests. "Let's talk about this in private." "In private?" Isabella laughed, a short, sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "You mean like you and your mistress were just minutes before you were supposed to pledge your life to me, to our child?" The word mistress hung in the air, an accusation so vulgar and direct, it shocked the refined crowd into another stunned silence. The word child was a second blow twisting the knife of betrayal. Everyone knew she was pregnant. The crime was now doubled a sin against both a wife and a mother. Her eyes found Richard in the crowd. He froze, his face a mess of guilt and terror. "I believe the woman's name is Scarlett Dubois," Isabella announced, her voice precise and unforgiving. "She's a junior analyst at Sterling Holdings. For those of you on the board, you might want to review your company's policies on fraternization, especially when it involves the CEO-to-be actively cheating on his pregnant fiancée during his own wedding." Every detail was a nail in the coffin. She wasn't just airing dirty laundry. She was meticulously documenting the crime for the whole world to see. She named the woman, her position, the company, the location, the timing. It was a masterclass in controlled demolition. Richard looked utterly broken, exposed. He looked to his mother for help, but Victoria was staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. He had not just embarrassed the family. He had single-handedly torpedoed her life's work, the merger in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. He had proven himself to be exactly what she feared most, a weak, foolish boy ruled by his basest impulses. Isabella's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at her own family. Her father's face was a canvas of shock and dawning rage. Her mother was weeping silently. And Leo was looking at her with an expression of fierce, absolute pride. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I've got you." She turned back to the crowd. "I apologize for wasting your time," she said, her formal tone returning. "But I believe in transparency, and I will not begin a marriage, a family, or a business partnership based on a foundation of such profound disrespect and deceit. She placed the microphone carefully back on the stand. The silence was broken by the sound of her footsteps on the stone path as she walked back the way she came. It was the most powerful walk of her life. She didn't run. She didn't stumble. She moved with the grace and dignity of a queen abdicating a throne she had just discovered was made of filth. As she reached the archway, she unclasped the sterling diamond, the ridiculously large engagement ring Richard had given her. It felt cold and foreign on her finger. She held it out to Leo as he met her. "See that our lawyers get this back to them," she said, her voice a low murmur, "along with a bill for half of this catastrophe." Leo took the ring, his hand closing over it. "Consider it done." "What now?" "Now," Isabella said, taking her brother's arm and not looking back at the chaos erupting behind them. "We go home, and then we go to war." The fairy tale was over. The carefully constructed facade had been shattered into a million pieces. As the Rossi siblings disappeared into the house, leaving the Sterling Empire to implode in a garden of dying lilies, one thing was clear. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a drama that would make the cancelled wedding look like a minor skirmish in a much larger, more brutal conflict. The sleeping giant of the Rossi family had been awakened, and hell hath no fury like a billionaire heiress scorned. The drive from the Long Island estate back to Isabella's Manhattan penthouse was a study in surreal silence. Leo drove the black Maybach with a focused intensity, navigating the traffic as if it were a hostile battleground. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blur of the city, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The adrenaline of the confrontation had begun to fade, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache that settled in her bones. She wasn't crying. The betrayal felt too vast, too seismic for tears. It was a tectonic shift in the landscape of her life, and she was still surveying the wreckage. Her phone, which she'd left in the bridal suite, had been retrieved by Leo's security detail. When they finally entered the quiet, sun-drenched expanse of her penthouse overlooking Central Park, her head of security, a stoic ex-Mossad agent named Gabriel, handed it to her. "It hasn't stopped, Miss Rosie," he said, his voice impassive. "We've identified 37 unique numbers from the Sterling family and their associates, and over 200 calls from blocked numbers we assume are media." "Turn it off," Leo commanded. "Bella doesn't need to hear from any of them." "No," Isabella said, her voice surprisingly firm. She took the phone. "I want to see the groveling." She powered it on. The device vibrated violently in her hand as a tsunami of notifications flooded the screen. Voicemails, text messages, missed calls. Most were from Richard. She clicked on the most recent voicemail, putting it on speaker. Richard's voice, thick with manufactured tears and genuine panic, filled the room. "Bella. My God. Bella, I am so sorry. You don't understand. It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. She means nothing to me. It was Marcus. He kept pouring me drinks, saying I was nervous. Scarlett was just there. I don't even know how it happened. Please just talk to me. We can fix this. I love you. I love our baby. Don't throw this all away because of one moment of insanity." Isabella listened with a detached curiosity, as if studying a particularly loathsome insect under a microscope. "He blames Marcus. He blames the alcohol. He calls her meaningless. He hasn't taken one shred of responsibility." She observed, her voice clinical. She deleted the voicemail without a second thought. The next was from Victoria. Her tone was not apologetic, it was furious. "Isabella, you have made a catastrophic error in judgment. Whatever foolishness Richard engaged in it was a private matter. To detonate it publicly, to jeopardize a multi-billion-dollar merger out of pure emotional hysterics, is unforgivable. You have proven yourself to be exactly the kind of liability I feared. Call me back when you have decided to act like an adult and salvage this situation, not for Richard's sake, but for the sake of our shareholders." Leo let out a short, harsh laugh. "She's worried about the shareholders, of course. Her son humiliates you in the worst possible way, and her first thought is the stock price." "It's all she knows," Isabella said, deleting Victoria's message as well. She scrolled through the texts. Pathetic apologies from Richard. Demands from his father. Even a bizarrely threatening message from an unknown number that read, "You just made a very powerful enemy, you little bitch." She suspected it was Marcus Thorne. She tossed the phone onto the marble island in her kitchen. "Lawyers," she said to Leo, "get our legal team on a conference call. I want the merger dissolution papers drafted by Monday. I want a press release from Rossi Lifestyle by noon tomorrow, stating our position clearly. I want our PR team to get ahead of this narrative. I am not the hysterical woman. I am the CEO who uncovered a fatal flaw in a potential partner's leadership and acted decisively to protect my company's interests." Leo was already on his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "Done. I'm calling Marco, then Julia from P. What about the personal side?" "Personal side," Isabella repeated the words as if they were from a foreign language. "There is no personal side anymore. He made it business when he cheated with a company employee. He made it business when he risked our family's name. Victoria made it business when she called me a liability to." The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated strategic warfare. While the Sterlings were in panicked damage control, fielding calls from irate board members and trying to spin a narrative of a troubled emotional bride, the Rossi team launched a surgical PR strike. Their press release was a masterpiece of corporate speak, framing the cancelled wedding and merger as a fundamental divergence in corporate ethics and leadership values discovered at a critical juncture. It never mentioned cheating, but the implication was clear. They were the stable, honorable party, extricating themselves from a toxic partner. The media, smelling blood, went into a frenzy. Paparazzi camped outside Isabella's building and the Sterling Holdings headquarters. Gossip sites published grainy photos of Scarlett Dubois fleeing the wedding venue, her face hidden in shame. Her identity, her job, her social media profiles, everything was dug up and put on public display. She became the digital Scarlet woman torn apart by an anonymous online mob. Isabella felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Scarlett's defiant smirk in that study. Meanwhile, Leo was dismantling the financial ties that had already begun to bind the two companies. He was ruthless. Joint accounts were frozen. Preliminary integration budgets were clawed back. A penalty clause in the initial merger agreement, one Leo himself had insisted upon covering, breaches of good faith and personal conduct by key principles was invoked. It would cost Sterling Holdings hundreds of millions of dollars. Isabella spent most of her time in her penthouse, a gilded fortress against the storm outside. Her mother Sophia had arrived, bringing with her the scent of home-cooked food and unconditional love. She didn't offer advice or judgment. She simply sat with Isabella, held her hand, and let her be silent when she needed silence and rage when she needed to rage. The rage came on the third day. Isabella was standing in the nursery she had so lovingly designed. It was a serene space of soft creams and gentle greys, with a hand-painted mural of a whimsical forest on one wall. A tiny crib stood assembled in the corner. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, and suddenly the full weight of her loss crashed down on her. It wasn't just the loss of a husband, but the loss of a dream of the family she thought she was building for her child. She let out a guttural sob, a sound of pure animal pain. And then she began to dismantle the room. She didn't break anything. Her actions were deliberate, methodical. She folded the tiny clothes and placed them back in their boxes. She took down the mobile of soft, felted stars. She pushed the crib against the wall. She was erasing Richard, erasing the future they were supposed to have, clearing the space for a new one she would have to build alone. Later that evening, Leo came to her apartment. He found her in the now barren nursery, sitting in the rocking chair, staring at the blank space where the crib had been. "The market's open today," he said, softly, leaning against the doorframe. Isabella didn't turn. "How bad was it?" "Worse than we thought." "For them," Leo clarified. Sterling Holdings dropped 17% at the opening bell. The financial press is calling it the Sterling implosion. Our stock, on the other hand, is up 3%. The narrative is holding we're seen as the strong, stable ones who dodged a bullet. A grim satisfaction settled over her. "Good. There's more," Leo said, his tone shifting. "Something's not right. The penalty clause I invoked. Sterling's lawyers are fighting it, which is expected. But their arguments are weak, almost distracted. And I've been looking at some of the preliminary financial data we shared during the due diligence phase. There are anomalies." This caught Isabella's attention. She turned to look at her brother. "What kind of anomalies?" "Small things. Discrepancies in growth projections for certain offshore assets. A few encrypted data packets that our tech team flagged as unusual during the transfer. At the time, we chalked it up to Sterling's sloppy data management. But now, I don't know. It feels different." He walked further into the room. "Think about it, Bella. The affair was stupid. It was arrogant. But the timing, on the morning of the wedding at the venue itself, it's almost too perfect, too self-destructive. Richard is weak and entitled, but is he suicidal?" A new thought, cold and sharp, cut through Isabella's grief. Leo was right. The sheer brazen stupidity of Richard's actions was hard to reconcile. It was a level of recklessness that bordered on the theatrical. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting," Leo said, his eyes narrowing, "that maybe the affair wasn't the main event. Maybe it was a distraction, a smokescreen designed to cause exactly this kind of chaos. The question is, what was it meant to hide? The world, which had just been shattered, shifted again. Isabella had thought she was at the center of a drama about love and betrayal, but the cold dread creeping into her heart suggested she had been a pawn in an entirely different game. One with stakes that might be far higher than a broken heart and a cancelled wedding. The unraveling, she realized, had only just begun. The seed of doubt Leo had planted grew into a thicket of suspicion in Isabella's mind. For the next 2 weeks, while the world feasted on the scraps of her personal drama, she and her brother initiated a covert operation. They assembled a small, trusted team, Marco, their head of legal, Julia, their PR chief, a forensic accountant named Anya Sharma, who had a reputation for finding needles in digital haystacks, and Gabriel, their head of security, who was tasked with digging into the lives of Richard Marcus Thorne and Scarlett Dubois. Isabella worked from her penthouse, which had been transformed into a war room. The large dining table was covered in laptops, financial reports, and timelines. The grief was still there, a constant, dull ache, but it was now overlaid with a cold, energizing fury. She had been played. Her pain, her humiliation, her child's future, it had all been collateral damage in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Now she wanted to know the rules, and she wanted to burn the whole game board to the ground. Anya Sharma struck first. "The anomalies Leo flagged are real," she announced during a late-night conference call, her voice crisp and excited. "During the due diligence data transfer, Sterling Holdings sent us several large encrypted archive files containing their projections and asset valuations. Standard procedure. But buried within 3 of those archives were ghost protocols, essentially hidden programs that ran in the background while our servers were analyzing the data." "What did the programs do?" Isabella asked, leaning forward, her coffee forgotten. "They didn't steal anything," Anya said. "That would have triggered alarms. They did something much smarter. They made micro-alterations to our own predictive models. Tiny, insignificant changes to algorithm variables that over time would have skewed our valuation of their assets, specifically their new tech and derivatives divisions, making them appear more stable and profitable than they actually were." Leo swore softly in Italian. "So they weren't just showing us fake numbers. They were hacking us to make us believe their fake numbers were our own idea." "Exactly," Anya confirmed. "It's brilliant and terrifyingly subtle. The financial discrepancy would have been a rounding error at first, but post-merger it would have become a black hole. Sterling Rossi Global would have been carrying billions in toxic, overvalued assets from their side of the ledger. Within a year or 2 it would have triggered a catastrophic devaluation." "A corporate Trojan horse," Isabella whispered, the pieces beginning to click into place. "Victoria would never sanction that. She's ruthless, but she's not stupid. A collapse like that would destroy the Sterling name forever." "Which means someone else at Sterling Holdings was running this play." Leo concluded, his voice grim. "Someone who stood to gain from the chaos." The spotlight fell squarely on 2 people, Richard and Marcus Thorne. At the same time, Gabriel's report landed on Isabella's desk. It was a deep dive into the lives of her ex-fiancé and his best man. Richard's profile was predictable, a history of lavish spending, a string of short-term relationships with models and actresses, and a deep-seated psychological need for his mother's approval. But Marcus Thorne's profile was far more interesting. On the surface, he was the loyal number 2. But Gabriel's team had dug deeper. Marcus came from a family that had been rivals with the Sterlings 2 generations ago, before his own family's fortune had collapsed. He had joined Sterling Holdings with a chip on his shoulder, working his way up while living in Richard's shadow. Gabriel had also uncovered a series of encrypted communications and offshore bank transfers. Marcus was living far beyond his declared salary, and the money trail led to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The final piece of the puzzle was Scarlett Dubois. Gabriel's team found that she wasn't just a random ambitious analyst. Her university tuition had been paid for by an anonymous scholarship fund. A fund that Gabriel, through painstaking digital forensics, traced back to the same Cayman Islands holding company that was financing Marcus Thorne. "He's been cultivating her for years," Isabella breathed, staring at the interconnected lines she had drawn on a whiteboard. She was his asset. He placed her inside the company, probably instructed her to get close to Richard, knowing Richard's weakness for a pretty face and a bit of ego stroking. "It's a classic intelligence operation," Gabriel stated. "Thorne is the handler, Dubois is the honey trap." The full horrifying picture began to emerge. This was Marcus Thorne's endgame. He wasn't Richard's friend. He was his nemesis, playing a long, patient game of revenge and ambition. "So here's the play," Leo said, pacing the room, piecing it together. "Marcus plants the Trojan horse in the merger data. He knows it will eventually cripple the new company, but that's not enough. He wants to take over. He needs to discredit the Sterling leadership, namely Richard, and cause a crisis that sends the stock price plummeting." "The affair," Isabella finished, her voice laced with ice. "It was the perfect catalyst. He goads Richard, who is already a willing fool, into a situation he knows Richard can't resist. He makes sure it happens at the most public, most damaging time possible. He wanted me to find them. He wanted the public explosion. It wasn't just about stopping the merger. It was about cratering Sterling Holdings' value." "So he could trigger a hostile takeover," Anya added. "With the stock in freefall, the company would be vulnerable. He and his backers, whoever is behind that Cayman account, could swoop in and buy up a controlling interest for pennies on the dollar. He gets his revenge on the Sterlings. He gets the company, and he gets to be the hero who rescues it from the ashes." Leo summarized, shaking his head in disbelief at the sheer Machiavellian audacity of the plan. It was all there. The cheating scandal wasn't the story. It was the cover. Isabella's public humiliation had been a meticulously planned strategic move in a corporate coup. The realization didn't lessen her pain, but it transformed it. The grief of a victim was replaced by the cold, calculating rage of a queen who had been used as a pawn in a commoner's coup. "Richard," Isabella said the name, testing it. "Where does he fit? Is he a total idiot, or was he a willing participant?" "I think he's a fool, not a conspirator," Leo reasoned. "Marcus likely sold him a different story. Sow some wild oats before you settle down. Have one last fling." He played on Richard's ego and insecurities. Richard thought he was just being a playboy. He had no idea he was the sacrificial lamb. Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights. They seemed sharper now, colder. She had been betrayed on a level she could scarcely comprehend. Her heart had been broken to create a market opportunity. "They underestimated me," she said, softly, her reflection staring back at her from the dark glass. "They all did. Richard thought I was just a prize. Victoria thought I was an asset. And Marcus thought I was a hysterical woman who would just cry and cancel a wedding." She turned back to the room, her eyes burning with a new fire. "He's right about one thing. I did cancel the wedding. Now I'm going to cancel his entire future." She looked at Leo, at Anya, at Gabriel. "We have the proof of the financial fraud. We have the connection between Marcus and Scarlett. We have the motive. It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to show them what a Rossi does when you threaten our family and our house." The serpent had played his game, but he had made a fatal error. He had attacked the lioness in her own den, and he had forgotten that she had claws of her own. The war for Sterling Holdings was about to enter a new bloody chapter, and Isabella Rossi, the scorned bride, was about to become its unlikely conqueror. Isabella did not move with the speed of a woman seeking vengeance. She moved with the cold, deliberate precision of a master chess player setting up a checkmate. For a week, she did nothing, letting the public narrative solidify. Sterling Holdings continued its slow-motion collapse. The stock had stabilized, but was still down almost 30% from its pre-wedding value. Board members were in open revolt, and Victoria Sterling was fighting a losing battle to maintain control her every move, hampered by the public disgrace of her son. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, was playing his part perfectly. He was the picture of loyalty, publicly defending the Sterling family, while privately telling key investors and board members that Richard was an unstable liability, and Victoria had lost her touch. He was positioning himself as the only viable successor, the steady hand needed to guide the company through the storm he had created. The first move of Isabella's counterattack was silent and devastating. Through a neutral third-party law firm based in Geneva, Leo, acting on Isabella's instructions, forwarded Anya Sharma's entire forensic report on the Trojan Horse data breach to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice. The report was submitted anonymously, flagged as a whistleblower complaint originating from within Sterling Holdings itself. It detailed the attempted fraud, the ghost protocols, and the potential for massive shareholder deception without once mentioning the Rossi family. 2 days later, federal agents walked into the Sterling Holdings headquarters in Midtown with a warrant. They seized servers, computers, and files. The raid made national news, sending a fresh shockwave of panic through the investment community. The stock, which had been limping, now nosedived into a catastrophic freefall. The narrative was no longer about a cheating fiancé. It was about systemic, high-level corporate fraud. Victoria and Richard were blindsided. They had been so focused on the personal scandal that they had no idea a financial guillotine was hanging over their heads. Isabella's second move was targeted at Marcus Thorne himself. While the federal investigation paralyzed the company, Gabriel delivered a dossier to her. It contained irrefutable proof of the offshore account, the payments to Scarlett Dubois, and the crown jewel, a secretly recorded audio file. Gabriel's team had managed to recover a conversation between Marcus and one of his co-conspirators, a disgruntled board member from a cloud backup. In the recording, Marcus laid out his entire plan. The sabotage of the merger, the use of the affair to spook the filly, his disgusting term for Isabella, and his strategy to trigger a hostile takeover using funds from their Cayman Islands entity. Isabella didn't leak the audio. That would be too simple, too chaotic. She decided to deliver the blow herself. She requested a meeting with the Sterling Holdings Board of Directors. The request, coming from the woman at the center of their company's downfall, was met with stunned confusion. But her family was still a major player in the global market, and refusing her would look weak. They agreed, holding the meeting in their cavernous, wood-paneled boardroom, the very heart of the Sterling Empire. Isabella walked into that room, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. She was dressed in a sharply tailored crimson suit, the color of power and blood. She was visibly pregnant, a silent testament to the personal cost of the drama, but her demeanor was pure steel. Leo was by her side, his presence a silent warning. Victoria, Richard, and the entire board, including a smug-looking Marcus Thorne, were seated around the massive table. Victoria's face was a mask of cold fury. Richard couldn't even look at her. He stared at the table, a broken man. "Thank you for seeing me." Isabella began, her voice calm and clear, filling the tense silence. "I know my presence here is unexpected. I am not here to relitigate the personal events of the past few weeks. I am here to talk about the future of this company." "You have no right to be here," Victoria snapped. "You have done enough damage." "On the contrary," Isabella replied, her eyes locking with Victoria's. "I am here because I am the only person in this room who knows the full truth of why your company is burning to the ground, and it has very little to do with my cancelled wedding." She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, whose smug expression was beginning to falter, replaced by a flicker of alarm. "For weeks you have all been operating under the assumption that this crisis was caused by a personal indiscretion. You are wrong. The affair was merely a tool, a brightly colored flag waved to distract the bull while the matador prepared the killing blow. She nodded to Leo, who placed a small, sleek speaker on the center of the table. "I believe you all know Marcus Thorne," Isabella said, her voice dropping. "You see him as Richard's loyal right hand, the future of this company, perhaps. But I'd like to introduce you to the real Marcus Thorne." She pressed play. Marcus's voice filled the boardroom, arrogant and chillingly clear. "The beauty of it is the simplicity. We let pretty boy Richard hang himself with his own zipper. The girl Scarlett played her part perfectly. The pregnant fiancés, the filly spooks, just like I said she would. She cancels everything, makes a big dramatic scene. The stock tanks on the personal drama. Then while they're all running around putting out that fire, the feds get the anonymous tip about the merger data. By the time they figure out what's really going on, we've already bought up 30% of the stock from the Caymans. We rescue the company. I take the throne. The Sterlings are history." The silence that followed the recording was heavier than a tombstone. Every eye in the room turned to Marcus Thorne. His face was the color of ash. He half rose from his chair, sputtering, trying to form a denial, but no words came. He was utterly, completely exposed. Victoria Sterling looked as if she had been turned to stone. The betrayal from her son was one thing, but this was a viper she had nurtured in her own nest, a man who had plotted the utter destruction of her life's work, while smiling to her face. Isabella pressed a second button, and an email was sent simultaneously to everyone in the room. "That is the audio file. You will also now have a full dossier detailing Mr. Thorne's offshore accounts, his conspiracy with certain members of this board, and his long-term cultivation of Scarlett Dubois as a corporate espionage asset. I have taken the liberty of forwarding this entire package to the lead investigator at the SEC. I believe they will find it very illuminating." Marcus Thorne sank back into his chair, a dead man walking. His career was over. His freedom was next. Isabella finally allowed her gaze to fall upon Richard. He was staring at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for a forgiveness he would never receive. He finally understood that he had not been a player, but a pawn. He had lost everything: his fiancée, his child, his company, his family's respect. Not for a passionate mistake, but as a calculated move in someone else's game. It was a truth more damning than any affair. "As of this morning," Isabella announced, her voice ringing with finality, "Rossi Lifestyle, through a subsidiary investment fund, has acquired a 28% stake in Sterling Holdings, purchased on the open market at its current distressed value. We are now the single largest shareholder." She let that bombshell settle. She owned them. "We will be calling for an emergency shareholder meeting to remove the current board and install new leadership. My brother Leo Rossi will act as interim chairman. We will cooperate fully with the federal investigation. We will rebuild this company based on the Rossi values: integrity, transparency, and strength." She stood up. Her point made her victory absolute. She had not just weathered the storm. She had harnessed its power and used it to conquer her enemies. She walked toward the door, pausing only when she was level with Richard. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with a final dismissive indifference. "You were right about one thing, Richard," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was a meaningless mistake. You are a meaningless man." With that, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of the Sterling dynasty. She stepped out into the bright Manhattan sunshine, took a deep breath of the free air, and placed a hand on her stomach. The baby kicked a steady, strong rhythm. It was a new world, a new future. One she had secured not as a bride, but as a warrior. A queen who had faced down betrayal and built an empire from the ashes. And so the fairy tale wedding ended not with a kiss, but with a hostile takeover. Isabella Rossi walked away from the wreckage, not as a heartbroken victim, but as a triumphant queen who had turned the deepest betrayal of her life into her greatest victory. She proved that the strongest empires aren't built on contracts and mergers, but on unbreakable integrity and the fierce, unyielding power of a woman determined to protect her own. Her story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most devastating endings are merely the foundation for glorious new beginnings. What would you have done in Isabella's shoes? Could you find the strength to not only walk away, but to fight back and win? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience, justice, and ultimate empowerment resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for listening.